There's a meeting that happened that nobody officially confirmed. A conversation between two of the most powerful leaders in the Muslim world that was conducted with the kind of secrecy that powerful men deploy when they know that what they are agreeing to would alarm their allies, if those allies knew about it before the agreement was complete. A pact built in private, sealed without cameras, and deployed publicly only once it was too late for the people most affected by it to change the outcome. Mohammed bin Salman and Recep Tayyip Erdoğan made a deal. And Abu Dhabi, for all its intelligence capability, for all its sophisticated monitoring of regional political developments, for all its investment in building influence across the Muslim world, did not know it was happening until the effects of it started landing on the UAE's strategic interests like a series of quiet explosions that nobody could definitively trace back to a single source. The UAE is not naive. Abu Dhabi's foreign policy establishment includes some of the most capable strategic thinkers in the region. But MBS and Erdogan built this pact in a way that was specifically designed to be invisible until activation. Each individual piece of what they agreed to was deniable on its own. Each bilateral communication was interpretable in multiple ways. The full picture only became clear when all the pieces activated simultaneously, and the pattern revealed itself in a way that was unmistakable. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly what MBS and Erdogan agreed to, why they needed to keep it from Abu Dhabi specifically, what each of them gets out of a pact that sidelined the UAE at a critical moment, and what this secret deal means for the future of the Islamic military coalition, for Gulf security architecture, and for the balance of power between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE in the post-conflict Middle East. Let us start with the backstory between MBS and Erdogan, because the relationship between these two men has been one of the most complicated and most consequential bilateral relationships in the Muslim world over the past decade. And understanding its history is essential to understanding what they just agreed to. MBS and Erdogan have had one of the most publicly hostile relationships of any two leaders in the modern Middle East. The October 2018 murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul put the two men on a collision course that defined their relationship for years. Erdogan used the Khashoggi case relentlessly, making statements to the press, releasing information to journalists, maintaining international pressure on MBS and on the Saudi government in ways that were clearly designed to damage MBS's international reputation and to extract concessions from Riyadh. The Khashoggi affair created a diplomatic rupture between Saudi Arabia and Turkey that affected bilateral trade, bilateral investment, and bilateral political communication for years. And then, in 2022, something changed. Erdogan visited Saudi Arabia. MBS received him. There were handshakes and meetings and the kind of visible diplomatic warmth that signals to the world that a rift has been formally healed. The economic relationship between Saudi Arabia and Turkey was normalized. Saudi investment in Turkey began flowing again. Turkish goods that had been subject to informal Saudi boycotts started moving again. The official story was reconciliation, driven by pragmatic economic interests on both sides. But the reconciliation was not just about economics. Something deeper happened in those conversations that the economic normalization provided cover for. MBS and Erdogan found that they shared a specific vision for what the Islamic military counterterrorism coalition should be and what role it should play in the Muslim world's security architecture. And they found that the most significant obstacle to implementing that shared vision was not Iran or America or any external power. It was the UAE's divergent preferences about the coalition's direction and the UAE's insistence on connecting the coalition to Western security frameworks in ways that both MBS and Erdogan found strategically counterproductive. The UAE-Saudi tension within the coalition that we have been analyzing is real and documented. Abu Dhabi wants the coalition to deepen its connections to Western security institutions. MBS wants the coalition to maintain its independence from Western institutional frameworks. These are not trivial differences of emphasis. They represent fundamentally different visions for what the institution is and what it is for. A coalition that is deeply connected to NATO and to Western security architecture is a different institution with different strategic implications than a coalition that operates as a genuinely independent Muslim world security institution. For Erdogan, the difference is even more fundamental than it is for MBS. Turkey is in NATO. Turkey has direct experience with what it means to be deeply integrated into a Western-led security alliance, and with the constraints that integration places on an independently minded government. Erdogan has spent years trying to carve out more strategic autonomy for Turkey within those constraints, buying Russian air defense systems, developing independent foreign policy positions on Syria and Libya, deepening economic relationships with China, maintaining channels with Iran. Every one of those moves has created friction with NATO allies, who expect Turkey to align its foreign policy with Western preferences. The Islamic military coalition represents for Erdogan something that Turkey's NATO membership cannot provide. An institutional framework for projecting Turkish power and Turkish influence across the Muslim world that does not require deferring to American or European preferences. A forum where Turkey's size, its military capability, its historical connections to the Ottoman world, and its Islamic credentials give it influence and prestige that its NATO membership never translated into. Erdogan wants that forum to be genuinely independent of Western direction. He wants it to be an institution that proves Turkey can be a major Muslim world power without America's permission. That vision aligns perfectly with MBS's vision for the coalition as the foundation of Saudi regional leadership in the Muslim world, rather than as an extension of the Western-led international security order. Two powerful leaders with different motivations, but precisely overlapping strategic preferences on the specific question of coalition independence from Western institutional frameworks. That overlap is the foundation of the Pact. The specific content of what MBS and Erdogan agreed to contains several dimensions that together constitute a coherent strategic program for the coalition's development that directly disadvantages the UAE's preferred direction. The first dimension is the formal coalition positioning on Western security integration. MBS and Erdogan agreed that the coalition will not pursue formal institutional links to NATO, to European security frameworks, or to any other Western-led multilateral security institution. This is the dimension that most directly confronts UAE preferences, and that Abu Dhabi has been most vocal about wanting to see developed differently. The MBS-Erdogan Pact makes that UAE preference essentially irrelevant, because the two most powerful members of the coalition have agreed on the opposite position. The second dimension is the expansion of coalition membership in directions that strengthen the Saudi-Turkish axis within the institution. Erdogan has relationships with Muslim-majority countries across Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia that Saudi Arabia's Gulf-focused diplomacy has historically been less engaged with. The pact includes agreement to pursue coordinated membership expansion that brings in countries where Erdogan has influence and where the new members will be more aligned with the Saudi-Turkish vision of coalition independence than with UAE-backed Western integration. The third dimension is the financial architecture of the coalition's development going forward. Saudi financial resources have funded the coalition's operational development. The pact includes agreement that Turkish defense industry capability will be integrated into the coalition's operational frameworks in ways that give Turkey a technology and manufacturing contribution that complements Saudi financial contribution. Turkish Bayraktar drones, Turkish armored vehicles, Turkish communication systems, all becoming part of the coalition's operational toolkit, gives Turkey a material stake in the institution that goes beyond diplomatic participation. And it reduces the relative importance of the UAE's own defense industry contributions that Abu Dhabi had been using as leverage to claim influence over coalition direction. The fourth dimension is the most sensitive and the one most directly affecting Abu Dhabi's strategic interests. MBS and Erdogan agreed on how the coalition will position itself relative to the Abraham Accords normalization process and relative to any future Saudi-Israeli normalization. Turkey does not have normalized relations with Israel. Erdogan's relationship with Netanyahu and with Israeli governments generally has been one of the most contentious of any Muslim-majority country. The pact includes agreement that the coalition as an institution will not be deployed as a vehicle for advancing Arab-Israeli normalization, and that Saudi Arabia's own normalization discussions with Israel will be kept strictly separate from the coalition's institutional framework. This is the dimension that most directly affects Abu Dhabi, because the UAE's own Abraham Accords normalization with Israel has been one of the most significant strategic moves in its recent history, and the UAE has been hoping to use the coalition framework to build broader Muslim world acceptance of the Arab-Israeli normalization trajectory. With MBS and Erdogan agreeing that the coalition will stay out of normalization politics entirely, the UAE loses a platform it was hoping to use for exactly that purpose. Abu Dhabi did not know this agreement was coming because MBS and Erdogan built it with specific care to keep it invisible to UAE intelligence. The communications between the two sides avoided the channels that UAE monitoring would most readily pick up. The meetings happened at bilateral events that were covered by legitimate diplomatic business. The specific content of the agreement was not reduced to written documents that could be intercepted. It was an oral agreement between two leaders who each had trusted channels of communication that their own governments could use without creating the kind of documentary trail that intelligence services routinely monitor. The activation of the agreement, the moment when its effects became visible to Abu Dhabi, came during the coalition response to the Aramco strike. The coordination between Saudi Arabia and Turkey on the coalition's institutional positioning statement that followed the strike included language that had been agreed between MBS and Erdogan, but that had not been brought to UAE consultation. When the statement was issued and Abu Dhabi's analysis team recognized specific formulations that reflected the Saudi-Turkish Pact on coalition independence, rather than the more balanced language the UAE had been expecting, the picture became clear. Abu Dhabi's reaction was immediate, and it was intense. UAE officials communicated directly with Saudi counterparts to express their concerns about the institutional direction being announced without UAE consultation. The Saudi response was measured, acknowledging UAE concerns but not offering to revise the positioning that had already been publicly stated. The UAE was being informed, not consulted. The decision had been made. The pact had been activated, and Abu Dhabi was in the position of having to decide how to respond to a fait accompli rather than participate in a decision-making process. The response Abu Dhabi chose was carefully calibrated to avoid an open break while making its displeasure unmistakably clear. UAE officials did not publicly criticize the coalition positioning. The institutional solidarity that requires all coalition members to present a unified face to the external world was maintained. But in private communications with both Saudi and Turkish counterparts, in the specific configuration of UAE participation in follow-on coalition activities, and in subtle shifts in UAE diplomatic positioning on related questions, Abu Dhabi sent signals that it understood what had happened, and that its assessment of its own coalition investment and its own relationship with Saudi Arabia within the institution was being recalibrated accordingly. This recalibration has implications that go beyond the specific question of the coalition's relationship to Western security frameworks. When a major contributing member of a multilateral institution discovers that the institution's most powerful members have been building agreements that affect the institution's direction. Without the contributing member's knowledge or participation, the contributing member's calculation about its level of investment and its level of trust in the institution changes. The UAE's willingness to commit operational military assets to coalition activities, its level of financial contribution to coalition development, and its enthusiasm for advocating the coalition as a security framework to other potential member states will all be affected by the experience of discovering the pact. For MBS, managing the UAE's response to the pact's activation is one of the most immediate tactical challenges created by the agreement with Erdogan. MBS needs the UAE inside the coalition and contributing at a high level. The UAE's air defense capability, its military sophistication, its financial resources, and its geographic position make it too valuable a coalition member to alienate. But MBS also needs the coalition to develop in the direction he and Erdogan have agreed on, rather than in the direction the UAE prefers. Managing that tension without losing Abu Dhabi's genuine commitment to the institution requires diplomatic skill that goes beyond the tactical maneuver that secured the Turkish alignment. Perhaps a specific operational leadership role in coalition activities that affects UAE territory directly. Perhaps a bilateral upgrade in the Saudi-UAE security relationship that gives Abu Dhabi something it values outside the coalition context, as compensation for its reduced influence over coalition institutional direction. Erdogan will watch MBS's management of the UAE relationship with interest and with his own calculations. Turkey's participation in the coalition creates its own complications, because every deepening of Turkish integration into the institution creates more questions from NATO allies about Turkey's strategic alignment. Erdogan needs the coalition to deliver genuine strategic value to Turkey to justify the NATO friction it creates. If MBS's management of the UAE situation produces an internal coalition crisis that undermines the institution's effectiveness, Turkey's benefits from participation are reduced, and Erdogan's willingness to absorb the NATO friction for those reduced benefits also reduces. For Pakistan, watching from its unique position as the coalition member with the deepest bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia and the closest nuclear security integration with Riyadh, the MBS-Erdogan Pact creates a specific diplomatic opportunity. Pakistan can position itself as the bridge between the Saudi-Turkish axis and the UAE's concerns. Pakistan's relationship with Turkey has been developing steadily, and Pakistan has its own strong reasons to want the coalition to function effectively and cohesively. A Pakistan that is seen as helping to manage the internal coalition tensions created by the MBS-Erdogan Pact becomes more indispensable to MBS and more valued by all coalition members simultaneously, which serves Pakistan's broader strategic interest in being an irreplaceable participant in the Gulf's security architecture. Saudi Arabia's financial resources, religious authority, and Gulf leadership, combined with Turkey's military capability, population, geographic position, and historical connection to the broader Muslim world, creates a partnership with the potential to shape the Islamic world's institutional architecture in fundamental ways. That partnership excludes or marginalizes every other Muslim world leader who might have claimed a comparable role. Iran's claim to Muslim world leadership is being actively contested by this conflict and by the coalition's unified response to Iranian behavior. Egypt's claim, based on al-Azhar's religious authority in the Arab world's most populous country, has never translated into the kind of institutional leadership that MBS has built through the coalition. Pakistan's claim, based on its nuclear capability and its 200 million Muslim population, is real, but constrained by Pakistan's economic situation and its South Asian geographic focus. The secret pact between MBS and Erdogan is the clearest expression yet of a new era in Muslim world politics, in which Saudi Arabia and Turkey jointly set the agenda for Islamic institutional development in ways that every other Muslim majority country has to accommodate rather than shape. Abu Dhabi did not see this pact coming. Most of the world did not see it coming. But it is here now, and the Muslim world's institutional landscape is going to reflect its existence for a very long time. Let us now look at what the MBS-Erdogan Pact means specifically for the countries that are not Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or the UAE, but that are deeply affected by the direction the Islamic military coalition takes going forward. Because the Pact's implications ripple outward from the three-way dynamic at its center into the broader Muslim world in ways that matter enormously for the institution's future and for the strategic calculations of dozens of coalition member states. Egypt is perhaps the most interesting case. Egypt's relationship with Saudi Arabia is foundational and decades old. Egyptian workers in Saudi Arabia, Saudi investment in Egypt, financial deposits in the Egyptian central bank, all create alignments that make Egyptian foreign policy broadly compatible with Saudi preferences. Egypt also has its own relationship with Turkey that has been through dramatic swings in recent years. After Sisi's 2013 coup, the relationship became deeply hostile, thawing only recently as pragmatic interest prevailed. That Turkish-Egyptian reconciliation creates a context in which the MBS-Erdogan Pact lands in Egypt quite differently than it does in the UAE. Cairo is not excluded from the Saudi-Turkish axis the way Abu Dhabi is. Egypt's alignment with Saudi Arabia on coalition independence from Western institutional frameworks is more comfortable than the UAE's. Egypt has its own reasons to value an independent Islamic framework that does not require deference to American preferences. Egyptian military aid from America for decades created dependencies that Sisi has been systematically diversifying. The coalition's independence orientation serves Egyptian interests without creating the UAE-style tension. What Egypt wants from the coalition is institutional recognition of its military weight and historical prestige. The MBS-Erdogan Pact, by establishing that coalition direction will be shaped by the Saudi-Turkish axis rather than Gulf financial contributors, actually gives Egypt more relative influence than it had before. Jordan is another coalition member whose reaction to the MBS-Erdogan Pact is worth examining. Jordan has a unique position in the Gulf security architecture because of its geography, its peace treaty with Israel, and its relationships with both the Gulf states and the Western powers. Jordan is the coalition member most directly affected by the Pact's position on the Abraham Accords and on Arab-Israeli normalization, because Jordan's own relationship with Israel is the most long-standing of any Arab country, and because Jordan's Hashemite monarchy derives significant legitimacy from its custodianship of the Islamic holy sites in Jerusalem. The coalition's institutional position of staying separate from normalization politics, established through the MBS-Erdogan Pact, actually serves Jordan's immediate interests, even if it was reached without Amman's explicit input. Jordan has been deeply uncomfortable with the pace and the direction of Arab-Israeli normalization as promoted through the Abraham Accords framework. The Jordanian government worries that normalization, without meaningful progress on Palestinian statehood, undermines Jordan's own position and creates instability that threatens Jordanian security. A coalition that stays separate from normalization politics is a coalition that Jordan can participate in without feeling that its membership implicitly endorses a normalization trajectory that Jordan has significant reservations about. The Southeast Asian coalition members, primarily Malaysia and Indonesia, are watching with a combination of interest and detachment that characterizes geographically distant members' engagement with a Gulf-centered institution. Neither country has a direct Gulf security interest comparable to the Gulf states themselves. What matters to Kuala Lumpur and Jakarta is whether the coalition's existence creates useful diplomatic cover for their own Muslim world positioning. The MBS-Erdogan Pact's implications for them are primarily about the Saudi-Turkish relationship's stability. A coalition where MBS and Erdogan are aligned is one Southeast Asian members are comfortable being associated with. A coalition with serious internal divisions is one they might prefer to keep at a more discreet distance. Pakistan's reaction to discovering the full details of the MBS-Erdogan Pact has been characteristically careful and strategically sophisticated. Pakistan was not entirely surprised by the existence of the Saudi-Turkish alignment on coalition independence. The broad outlines of that alignment had been visible to anyone paying close attention to the public positions both countries were taking on coalition direction questions. But the specific content of the pact, the formal agreement on coalition positioning relative to Western institutions, the coordinated approach to membership expansion, the integration of Turkish defense industry into coalition operational frameworks, these specific details were new information that required updating Pakistan's own assessment of its position within the coalition. The most important conclusion Pakistan drew from learning about the pact is that it needs to deepen its own relationship with Turkey within the coalition framework if it wants to maintain influence over the institution's direction. Pakistan's bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia gives it access to the Saudi principle within the Saudi-Turkish axis. But Pakistan's relationship with Turkey within the coalition context has been less developed than its Saudi relationship. Developing Turkish-Pakistani cooperation within the coalition framework, building the kind of operational integration that Pakistan has built with Saudi Arabia, would give Pakistan access to both principles of the Saudi-Turkish axis rather than just one. The broader international community watching all of this has its own specific reactions that will shape the context in which the MBS Erdogan Pact's implications play out. America is concerned, but not yet clear on how to respond. The State Department is trying to assess whether the UAE's exclusion from the pact and the coalition's formal independence from Western institutional frameworks represents a lasting strategic shift or tactical positioning that can be managed through the existing mechanisms of American Gulf bilateral relationships. The concern in Washington is not primarily about the specific content of the pact, but about the pattern it represents of Gulf states making major institutional decisions without American consultation or input. France, which has been developing its own significant relationships with Gulf states and which has a military presence in the UAE at Khalifa Port, is watching the MBS Erdogan Pact with its own specific interest. The French-UAE relationship has been one of the most substantial Western Gulf bilateral relationships in the region, including major arms sales, military cooperation agreements, and a permanent French naval base in Abu Dhabi. If the UAE's strategic discomfort with the MBS Erdogan Pact leads Abu Dhabi to deepen its French relationships as a counterbalance to Saudi-Turkish dominance within the coalition, France benefits from the internal coalition tensions in ways that serve French interests without France needing to do anything proactive. The conclusion that the MBS Erdogan Pact points toward is one that students of multilateral institutions will recognize from historical precedents. When the founding dominant member of a multilateral institution builds a bilateral alignment with the second most powerful member to lock in a specific institutional direction before all other significant members can organize an alternative, it creates a fait accompli that shapes the institution's development for years. The bilateral agreement is presented as established institutional policy. Members who were not part of the bilateral either accommodate the new direction or face the costs of openly challenging an established fact. Abu Dhabi did not see this coming, but now that it has arrived, Abu Dhabi faces exactly the choice that institutional fait accomplis always force. Accommodate and find what influence you can within the new framework. Challenge and bear the costs of being the member that disrupted coalition unity at a moment of regional crisis, or develop the alternative partnerships that reduce dependence on the coalition while maintaining the benefits of formal membership. Most sophisticated states choose a combination of all three simultaneously. The UAE is sophisticated. Expect exactly that combination in the months ahead, and watch whether MBS offers enough compensatory influence in other coalition dimensions to make accommodation genuinely attractive. The pact is done. The question now is what Abu Dhabi builds from the rubble of the strategic position it held before the pact was revealed. That answer will shape Gulf politics for years after the current conflict has become history. The broader conclusions that this secret pact forces every serious observer to reach is this. The Islamic military counterterrorism coalition is no longer a diplomatic aspiration with an uncertain future. It is a political institution with an established power structure, a dominant axis, and a set of institutional preferences that have been locked in through agreements reached outside the formal multilateral process. That is how every serious multilateral institution eventually develops. The question was never whether the coalition would develop an internal power hierarchy. The question was who would sit at its top and what agreements would lock in that hierarchy before other claimants could organize an effective challenge. MBS and Erdogan answered that question, and the world, including Abu Dhabi, is only now fully understanding the answer.